I love the way you open your Sunday services with those check-ins, and I'm told we do Q&A afterwards, and I love the questions afterwards, so that's pretty exciting stuff. You gave me some ideas for my own group. Yeah, you gave me some good ideas. So today we're going to be talking about living an empowered life, and I'm all about living empowered. And I was listening to your stories that you were telling before, and I think I might be preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to go ahead and jump into it anyway because that's what I've got prepared today. So when I decided to start preparing this talk, I looked up the definition of empowered, and I got to give power or authority to. Now, I don't know about you, but giving power or authority to something outside of myself really isn't on my list of things to do. I don't wish to give my power or my authority to anyone. And I also don't wish to be given my power. I wish to claim it. And I actually wrote, I aim to claim, which kind of struck, it sounds good, but it struck me a little off because it's not written in the present tense. I aim to claim as opposed to I do claim, which is what we do in our treatments. We do claim right here and right now. But I do prefer this definition of empowerment: to make someone stronger and more confident, especially in controlling their life and claiming their rights. I love that definition. That is a definition that I can sink my teeth into. That definition is what I come to mean of as empowerment. So if you look up antonyms for empower, meaning the opposite of empowerment, you get things like refuse, reject, disenfranchise. When I think of the opposite of being empowered, I think of victim. And I want to talk about this victimhood for a little bit because I think that we either live lives of victimhood or lives of empowerment. I don't think there's an in-between area. I don't think there's gray here. We either are empowered or we are victims. And I'm not talking about occasions when we get victimized. I'm talking about a consciousness. I'm talking about a consciousness of empowerment or a consciousness of victimhood. It is entirely possible to be empowered and get victimized, but we can always claim our power back after such an occurrence. Remember, I'm speaking to the overall consciousness here. That's the trend of our thinking, who we be and how we show up in the world. Do we show up in the world as an empowered, conscious being of light, child of God? Or do we show up in the world as a victim where life doesn't happen through us? It happens to us. That's the difference that I'm speaking to. And no one can empower us and no one can victimize us. And before you protest about some violence or some bad things that may have happened to you when you were younger or may have happened to you yesterday, it's possible. Again, I'm speaking about consciousness, and I'm speaking about, and I want to acknowledge that there are true victims in this world. There are children who are victimized. There are people who are victimized. People who are black get victimized on a regular basis. People who choose differently in this world get victimized on a regular basis if they go outside the status quo. I go outside the status quo quite a bit in certain areas. And sometimes, I get victimized. It consists lately of people trying to force their intentions on me. And I tell them no. Just no. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to do that. But some of us, if we're a certain race, a certain color, a certain religious denomination, a certain gender, a certain, if we make certain choices in the world for ourselves, we're targets. We do get victimized by others. And so how do we keep in congruence with those choices for ourselves? Especially if those choices run counter to what the status quo is. And we say no. How do we stand in congruence with our value system? It is easy to get wrapped up in the "they did this to me" cycle. And I'll be the first to admit that sometimes getting wrapped up in "he did that to me and I'm angry and I'm going to voice my rage to anyone who will listen." There's a certain sense of power that comes from that. But it's a very false sense of power. It's fleeting. And it's a power that's based in rage and anger and fear. It's not a power that's based in truth. And so what happens when we indulge in that power for too long? We get sick. We get depressed. It's not a true sense of power. When we say "they are bad and I am good and thus better than," that's not a true sense of power. It's transient, it's false. When we point fingers of blame outward at others, we disempower ourselves. And isn't this what's happening in society today? All of them are doing it wrong. If you're on one side of the political spectrum, the other side is doing it wrong and it's all their fault. And if you're on this side of the political spectrum, the other side is doing it wrong and it's all their fault. We are creating our own sense of victimhood in this society by pointing fingers and saying they are doing it wrong. Because we're creating separation from them. We're denying our own oneness. And we're declaring they're doing it wrong and they're doing it to us. And we're just creating more of the same. Somewhere along the line, we got to figure out how to do things differently. We got to figure out how to have different kinds of conversations, because the reality is there is no us and them. The reality is we're all part of this vast oneness, and we need to figure out how to get along and have different kinds of conversations than those kinds, because those kinds are going to kill us. They're going to kill us individually, and they're going to kill us collectively as a society. It's not a good way to be. Not a good way to be. So let's try and break out of that trap, shall we? I just felt the energy in here change. Oh my God, let's get that out. Let's break out of that. Ernest Holmes says, "Create or perish is the eternal mandate of nature. Be constructive or become frustrated is an equal demand." We must create. We are being called upon right here and right now in our own personal lives and in society to create something different, or we will perish. When Ernest Holmes says stuff like that, I believe it. I believe it. It's, he was a wise man. When he says that kind of stuff, I believe it. So how do we create? How do we create instead of perish? And I always have to go to spiritual practices when I'm looking at things like that. How do we create? Sometimes when I'm looking at how I've created victimhood for myself and I want to create something different and I want to go to spiritual practices, I go to some of the statements in our teachings, some of the fundamental values that we share in Centers for Spiritual Living in this movement called New Thought. And in Centers for Spiritual Living, we have a series of statements that, they're on almost every center's website. They're just about everywhere you look. They're in the Science of Mind magazine. They're called the We Believe statements. I use these statements as basic principles for my life. I use these statements as guiding principles for me. They're like a guiding light for me to live my life. It's a good starting point for us. So when we're in victim consciousness, when we're separating ourselves from them, when we're pointing the fingers outward of blame and just creating more victimhood for ourselves and for the overall race consciousness. It's time to return to statements like these and see if they resonate. And there's a bunch of statements. They're called the Declaration of Principles, also known as the We Believe statements. And they were also written by Ernest Holmes. And I don't necessarily believe or use all of those statements as my guiding light, but I encourage you to study them and see how they resonate with you. If you're familiar with them, go back and revisit them. If you're not familiar with them, check them out, because they're pretty profound, and sometimes they might push some buttons. And if they're pushing a button, guess what? That's a call. That's something that we need to look at. So here's one that pushes a lot of buttons. I love this statement because I believe in it entirely. I have used this statement for many years in my life. I know it is true. And yet there are people in this world who vehemently say, absolutely not. There is no way that this is true. Here's the statement. We believe in the healing of the sick and control of conditions through the power of this mind. Control of conditions, that's the part that I want to address today when we're talking about empowered lives. Isn't empowerment about controlling our conditions? It is for me. It is for me. So I have a little story to illustrate this principle. I could tell you dozens, literally dozens of personal stories about how this principle has shown up in my life as a very true one. That it is entirely possible to control conditions. But every month, with that set of talk outlines that we get, there's also a recommended book of the month. This month, the recommended book is called The Sun Does Shine. It's by a guy named Anthony Ray Hinton and Laura Love Hardin. This book is about a guy who was wrongly convicted of a murder he did not commit. And he lived on death row for 30 years. You might say this does not look like control of conditions. He was truly a victim. He is a black guy, and he got discriminated against, and it was just, his turn in the firing bin for a while, I guess. I don't know. He was wrongly convicted. If you dive into the story, you realize that Anthony Ray Hinton believed in a few spiritual principles, namely hope, justice, and love. So he gets wrongly convicted in spite of some evidence to the contrary, which they buried, in spite of his denials that he did not do the murder, in spite of all of it. They throw him in prison. They throw him on death row. He's there for 30 years. And yet he has these spiritual principles that he bases his life on. Hope, justice, and love. So he's in there on death row. And instead of blaming and pointing fingers and indulging in the victim consciousness, he used those principles to transform his own consciousness. And then he assisted the people around him in the prison to transform those. He was not the first person to prove that you can place a human in absolutely abhorrent conditions for all the wrong reasons. And they refuse to be victims. They absolutely refuse it. They still live lives filled with joy and humor. Hinton did that. And he was eventually exonerated. And that's how he came to write this book. He eventually controlled his conditions by the power of his mindful thoughts and consciousness of hope, justice, and love. That's how we become empowered. We latch onto a few basic spiritual principles like hope or justice or love. Mine happen to be love and joy and peace right now. Yours might be a little different. But this guy was hope, justice, and love. He realized that the process of manifestation began within, and he transformed his inner self. He moved himself from victim consciousness to empowered consciousness. Once he did that, then things on the outer just began to change. He planted seeds based on those spiritual principles of hope, love, and justice. And then he nurtured those seeds. And that's what we need to do. We find our spiritual principles that resonate with us. We live in those, we be those, we embody those. And then we move out into the world and we plant those seeds. That's how we move from victim to empowerment. I have another quote for you and another story about moving from victim to empowerment. This one is also from Ernest Holmes. He says, perhaps Emerson was right when he said that ignorance is the only sin there is. If so, wisdom is the only solution. And I have a confession to make to you. For the first 40 years of my life, I lived it as a victim. I was ignorant. I knew no different. I had a victim consciousness. I thought life happened to me, not through me. The details aren't important, and how I got that way is not important. What is important is the consciousness. I became strong. I didn't trust anybody or anything. I put up big walls, big walls. I didn't even trust God, because the God that I was familiar with was up there pulling apron strings or puppet strings, and I didn't like the way the strings were being pulled. I was a victim, big time. And I thought life happened to me, not through me. Around age 32 or so, I started getting a different concept of God. And so I started realizing that God was something within me. And I started realizing that God did not have human attributes. God had no desires for me. God was simply a source of those spiritual attributes that I wanted to embody. Power, peace, love, joy. So I latched onto that God and went on through the years, and then something happened at 40. And the details aren't important, but again, I went right back into victimhood because that's my default. It used to be, not anymore. That's my default. And I got angry and I got rageful, and I went into that consciousness of, well, if you're not for me, you're against me. You know that one. We've got leadership right now that says, if you're not for me, you're against me. What is up with that? Really? Oh my God. If you're not for me, you're against me. I actually felt that. And I knew it was wrong, but somehow I couldn't get out of it. I knew it was limiting me, but somehow I couldn't get out of it. So I bought into it, and I used that anger and rage and declared myself powerful and raged to anybody who would listen. And in the space of 2 years, I got sick. I was plunged into a clinical depression, and I literally could not get off the couch. And I realized the solution to this situation was not to change my outers, because this is an inside job, guys. I knew the solution to this little problem that I had of having a victim consciousness was a better connection with a different sort of a God, an even different one than the one I had already begun to envision in my life. I found myself reading a New Thought book by Neil Donald Walsh. You guys know him? Yes. I love that guy. To this day, I have no memory of how I came to be in possession of that book. But within the pages of that book, Conversations with God, Book 1, I had my own burning bush experience. All of a sudden, I had an instant change in consciousness as a result of this one little section in this book, and it can happen like that. We can move from victim consciousness to empowered consciousness willy-nilly, just like that. Here's what he wrote. If you believe that God is some omnipotent being who hears all prayers, says yes to some and no to others, and maybe but not now to the rest, you are mistaken. By what rule of thumb would God decide? If you believe God is the creator and decider of all things in your life, you are mistaken. God is the observer, not the creator. God stands ready to assist you in living your life, but not in the way you might expect. It is not God's function to create or uncreate the circumstances or conditions of your life. God created you in the image and likeness of God. You created the rest through the power God has given you. God created the process of life and life itself as you know it. God gave you free choice to do with life as you will. In this sense, your will for you is God's will for you. And I read that and I was beset with fear. I went, oh my God, yes and no. Both. I was beset with fear because it meant I had to embrace a new way of living. I had to know that God was there as a source of power and support for me, but I was the one creating the conditions. That was the great part, the empowerment part, the personal responsibility part. That was also the fearful part because I didn't know how to do that. It was a totally new way of being. It was a totally new consciousness for me. It was a huge change. It was way outside my comfort zone. And sometimes we have to go there if we're going to change our consciousness. But I did that, and I did some other things. I started coming to the Center for Spiritual Living, taking classes. I incorporated the spiritual principles of forgiveness and love into my life, and things began to change. And I began to see how wonderful it was to stop blaming others for my conditions. I even began to see how wonderful it was to stop blaming them for the conditions in this place I live in. I had responsibility. I was empowered. Today I know that if every once in a while I start to go back into that old default that's still there, but it's not really a default anymore. I need to take some time and look at who and what I am and how I'm showing up in the world and what I'm doing. I'm still not perfect at this. I still want to blame, guys. I still want to blame. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I move back into oneness and I move back into personal empowerment and personal responsibility. So I think we live empowered lives by having an unshakable and firm foundation in the love and the light of God. And upon that foundation, we nurture and develop that relationship with God by the use of spiritual practices. Mindfulness, introspection leading to self-awareness, meditation to connect. And we believe in and we live and we embody those principles based in love. And from those principles, we practice non-judgment, and we eliminate blame and shame from our lives. And in this way, we live empowered lives. And we use spiritual mind treatment to affirm our good and move our focus. So I'm going to close with this treatment from Ernest Holmes. I thought about how I wanted to close this talk today, and I could do a treatment of my own, but this treatment is so powerful, and it's straight out of the Science of Mind textbook, if you want to look it up. It's titled, I Allow Myself to Dip Deeply into My Divine Nature. This meditation speaks to moving from victimhood to empowerment. He writes, this meditation is built from the idea that each one of us has within himself a deeper nature. And of course, this deeper nature being an eternal unity with God, or with the living spirit, is more than man. It is where the being of man or the nature of man merges into the being of God. So as we dip deeply into our divine natures, let us realize that entering the secret presence of this tabernacle of God, we will, like the pilgrims of old, have to shed that which does not belong to the kingdom of good. We have to deliberately drop that which would hurt. We cannot enter this gate of good with a sword in our hands. So we let go of everything and turn to that divine depth within our own nature, wherein the Spirit of God, the Spirit of love, and the Spirit of peace dwells with calm serenity. We withdraw into that place within us which has never been hurt, never been sick, has always and forever lived in divine and eternal peace. The kingdom of God, which is good, and this inner kingdom within is all peace, all power, and all perfection. We drop all hate, all fear, all animosity, all resentment. We cast out of our consciousness every doubt and every sense of uncertainty. We know that we are entering into that atmosphere of wholeness, of happiness, of completion, where there is no fear, no doubt, no uncertainty, no lack, no want. Here is wholeness, perfection, peace, power, beauty, love, supply, and life. We know that the abundance of this life is showered upon us, that we are guided and guarded into right action, into right decision. Daily, hourly, minutely, the principle of intelligence guides us, the principle of love warms us, the peace of God covers us, and we are led into the pathway of this peace, into the knowledge of this perfection. We are conscious of the indwelling God, and we are conscious that the indwelling God is filling our bodies, absolutely eliminating from us whatever that is that does not belong, coordinating every function, every organ, every action, and every reaction, making it perfect. The life principle of every part of our being is perfect and harmonious, and now functions perfectly in us. The whole order of discord is changed into the natural order of harmony and wholeness, and we let that divine power be exactly what it is in us. We are no longer afraid, for love casts out fear. Our faith destroys all fear. We awake from the dream of fear to the vision of reality, where there is no shadow of which to be afraid. We awake from the dream of lack and want and unhappiness to the knowledge of harmony, of abundance, and of peace. I allow myself to dip deeply into my divine nature. Thank you. And so it is.